sisters. Tonight is a short chapter. The last couple of Wednesdays we have done a lot of reading, and thank you all for being patient and getting through that with me. Of course, talking about 2 Samuel, we are in the life of David, and we covered 1 Samuel some months ago. It took us a while to get through that book. You'll remember that in 1 Samuel, we come to, we're in this transitionary period between, you got the end of the period of the judges. So the children of Israel come into the promised land and they are ruled over by judges who were individual, gifted people that God would raise up at certain times to lead his people and to save his people from their enemies. Well, who was the last of those judges? Samuel, right? In addition to being a judge, what other two Old Testament offices did Samuel occupy? Okay, priest and prophet and judge, right? So he was a judge, he was a prophet, and he was also a priest. Well, in 1 Samuel, we read about then the transition from that era of the judges into the era of the monarchy, where the people ask Samuel for a king like the other nations. And that is that aspect of their question, not simply asking for a king, a more permanent ruler, a dynasty, something more permanent than the judges. They didn't just ask for that, but they wanted a specific type of king. They wanted to be like the nations around them. And so God tells Samuel, listen, they're not rejecting you. They are ultimately rejecting me, God says. And so then God gives them exactly what they want in King Saul. Now, did God use King Saul for the good of his people at times? Yes, absolutely. I mean, Saul's ministry, if you will, or his time as king starts off pretty well. He does deliver Israel from her enemies, but it doesn't take very long before Saul's true colors become very apparent. And so he is rejected by God because of flagrant acts of rebellion and disobedience, and God chooses another king, Jesse's son, David. And so the whole of 1 Samuel from that point on, or the rest of 1 Samuel from that point on, David is a loyal servant to Saul. He's best friends with Saul's son. He even becomes Saul's son-in-law when he marries Michal, the daughter of Saul. But Saul is incredibly jealous because the people seem to really appreciate David more than they appreciate Saul. Saul has slain his thousands, you remember, but David his tens of thousands. And so Saul is jealous of David. He seeks to kill him. But Saul, remember, is also oppressed by an evil spirit from the Lord. He's under demonic oppression. And that's sort of exacerbating all of this because God has pulled his Holy Spirit from Saul. And David has been anointed. Well, when we come then to 2 Samuel, Saul and Jonathan are both dead. They have both died in this battle that we read about at the end of 1 Samuel with the Philistines. The Philistines were kind of the perpetual thorn in Israel's side. And now David, at the beginning of 2 Samuel, has been anointed king, but only over one tribe. What tribe was that? Judah, right? Now, the people, or really Abner, the commander of Saul's army, has made another man king of the rest of the country. What was his name? Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. Well, last week, we read about the end of Abner. Does anybody remember what happens with Abner? Joab kills him ultimately. Okay, because Abner is accused of taking one of Saul's concubines for himself, and he says basically to Ishbosheth, what am I? Am I some dog? Am I some dog that's loyal to Judah? You insult me like this after all that I've done from your father? And he gets out of town and goes to David and says, David, listen, I pledge myself to you. I'm going to make you king. By the way, you are the one that God has chosen. Makes you wonder why he didn't come to David as soon as Saul died. If he understood that David was the one chosen to be the next king. Well, Abner is killed. And I mentioned this to you at the end of our study last week. Chapters 3 and 4, from everything we can tell by what's written, chapters 3 and 4 are very important for the writer of 2 Samuel because he's trying to demonstrate to us and make sure that we are clear on a couple of things. Number one, David had nothing to do with the slaying of Abner. Joab is clearly presented as the one who took this in his own hands, because remember, Abner had killed his brother. And by the way, Joab, if you'll recall, is related to David. Remember that? He's not just the commander of David's army, he's one of David's nephews. And so in this battle that had taken place, because there's this civil war going on, Asahel, Joab's brother, was pursued by Abner and was killed by Abner. So Joab feels like he's got to get vengeance for his family's honor, and he does that. Well, David curses him essentially, but he doesn't remove him from office. He doesn't even kill him. He leaves him there, right? So there's that question of why. Probably had something to do with the fact, we were talking about this at the end of our time last month. It probably had a lot to do with the fact he's family, I'm sure. That might have had something to do with it. But he doesn't punish Joab. That's going to be left to Saul's son Solomon, who closes the book on that injustice that happened to Abner. Okay, so we come now, we're going to read chapter 4, and we're going to go in just to the beginning of chapter 5. But again, the first thing that we are told that the author wants us to understand from chapter 3, David did not kill Abner. A lot of people might think that happened. Remember, a new king comes on the scene, a new dynasty rises to the throne. What do? You get rid of anyone associated with the previous king. Family, any powerful, loyal supporters. So you would think, well, who killed Abner? Well, David had to have. That's how kings operate. But that's not what David did. We'll talk about that more later. So let's pick up at chapter 4, and this is the second thing that the author wants us to understand about David. Not only did David not have anything to do with the death of Abner, he most certainly had nothing to do with the death of Ishbosheth, which we read about in this chapter. Now, when Ishbosheth, verse 1, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, he lost courage. The Hebrew is literally his hands dropped. So he has no strength anymore in his arms. That's the metaphor. So he's fearful. His legs have been taken out from under him, we might say. He lost courage, and all Israel was disturbed. Remember, Ishbosheth is not a powerful man in and of himself. Abner was the one who made him king. And he actually goes across the Jordan River into the region of the Transjordan to crown him king. So Ishbosheth is in a precarious position even when Abner is around. He's not king in sort of, we might say, Israel proper. He's kind of out in the frontier. Because he feels like, he's not safe to come into the main area of the country, into the central region of Israel. So now that his supporter has died, even though he's already left him, he hears he's dead, and he thinks, okay, there's absolutely nothing anymore standing between me and David. Perhaps he's also thinking similarly to what a lot of people would have thought. David is the new king, and he's going to do to me like any other king would. He's going to kill me. Because as long as I'm living, there is a person who can lay claim to Saul's throne. Verse 2, Saul's son, Ishbosheth, had two men who were commanders of bands. So these are military commanders. The name of the one was Bamah, the name of the other Rechab, sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, of the sons of Benjamin. For Beeroth is also considered part of Benjamin, and the Beerothites fled to Gittaim and have been aliens there until this day. So they come from the tribe of Benjamin, where Ishbosheth and his father Saul are of the tribe of Benjamin. So these are people that would have been close probably even to King Saul. Now, verse 4, Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son himself crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, that is, that his father and grandfather had been killed, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. Obviously, more on Mephibosheth later. Why are we given this little note about Mephibosheth here, do you think? Notice it says at the beginning of the verse, now Jonathan had this son. So it's kind of an aside, but it's given to us to explain something important. The reason we are given this little fact about Mephibosheth is because anybody familiar with the existence of this child would wonder, well, why not just make him king? If Ishbosheth is basically in his final days at this point, if his rule and reign in Israel about to come to an end, some people might ask, well, what about Mephibosheth? And so we're told two things about him. Number one, he's young. He's young. He's too young to be king. And number one, he's too young to be king. Number two is what? He's crippled. He's crippled. So people aren't necessarily, remember, what are they looking for? We want a king like the other nations by and large. We want a king who will go out and fight our battles for us. So he's not necessarily someone, he's too young and he's also crippled. People aren't necessarily going to rally around him. That's what's being told to us, okay? So even though there is a potential heir who is still living, he's not a danger like Ishbosheth is a danger to the rule of David. In other words, that's why we are told about Mephibosheth. And again, more about Mephibosheth later because he's also plays an important role in King David's reign. So, verse 5, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab, and Baanah departed and came to the house of Ishbosheth in the heat of the day while he was taking his midday rest. This, siesta, right? It's hot. He's taking his midday rest. They came to the middle of the house as if to get wheat, and they struck him in the belly, and Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. Now, when they came into the house, as he was lying on his bed in his bedroom, they struck him and killed him and beheaded him, and they took his head and traveled by way of the Arabah all night. Verse 8, then they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my lord, the king, vengeance this day on Saul and all of his descendants. Does this sound familiar? Based on what we've seen already, even in the book of 2 Samuel. Well, let's read on. So they think they're going to be rewarded. We got rid of your rival. We took vengeance on Saul's house for you. Where's our reward? Verse 9, David answered Rechab and Baanah his brother, sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, and he said to them, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress. Isn't that interesting? As the Lord lives, and then he adds this note, who has redeemed my life from all distress. What do you think David might be, genuine question, what do you think David might be implying by adding that little interesting note there about what the Lord has done for him? Who has delivered me from all my distress. Yes. He's referring to the persecution of Saul. I mean, he's referring to anything that's happened. Absolutely. Why might that be important? Why might David be recalling that? In other words, I'm sorry.
He doesn't need their
help. Yeah. You think I need your help? You think I need your help? Your former master hunted me from one side of the country to the other. Did he catch me? No. You think I need your help? You think I need your help? God's on my side. I don't need you to do this. You're acting like you somehow rendered this great service to me. The Lord is taking care of me the whole time, right? Okay, so let's look on because it gets interesting. Verse 10, when one told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, which was the reward that I gave him for his news. Who is this one? This is the guy who comes and says, I killed Saul. I saw Saul leaning upon his spear, and I killed him. You remember that we went over the options because when you read the end of 1 Samuel, when Saul, is trying to commit suicide and all that, I know it's grisly, these details, okay? But the Bible, of course, presents us with the real picture of what's going on here. It looks like Saul is dead, and so then there's this question of, at the beginning of 2 Samuel, this guy comes to David, and he says, well, he wasn't quite dead, so I finished the job. And so it's like, well, what happened? Did Saul kill himself, or did this man kill himself? There's a couple options. This man may well be lying, or he may be telling the truth. But regardless, he comes to David and says, I took care of the problem, took care of the guy on the throne for you, thinking he's going to be rewarded. Well, he got rewarded according to David, but not like he thought he was going to get rewarded. So I did give him a reward, just not what he thought. Verse 11, how much more, notice this, how much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his own bed, shall I not now require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth? Then David commanded the young men, and they killed them, cut off their hands and feet, hung them up beside the pool in Hebron, and they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. It's just intriguing to me how David describes Ishbosheth, a righteous man. So in other words, guys, look what I did to the guy that killed an unrighteous man, Saul. How much more you think I'm going to do to the person who kills a righteous man in his own house, on his own bed? In other words, he's trusting you guys and you betrayed him. And so he kills them as well and puts them on public display as a message to anyone else who would think to do something like this. Now notice something. Notice what David does not say. He doesn't say, you touch the Lord's anointed. Did you see that? Saul was who? The Lord's anointed. David said he had two opportunities to end Saul. You remember that? And he said, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. Far be it from me that I would lay a finger upon God's anointed. And so we saw over and over again in 1 Samuel how loyal David was to Saul's house. When we come into 2 Samuel, the people of Judah want to anoint him as king, and he allows that to happen. It's unthinkable that if, say, the people of Judah wanted to make David king when Saul was still on the throne, it's unthinkable he would have allowed that to happen. So he sees, in other words, he doesn't see himself as loyal to Ishbosheth as he was loyal to Saul. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? He recognizes, okay, now God is starting to bring these promises to fulfillment. The promise that I would be the king on the throne in the place of Saul. So he allows himself to be anointed king by the tribe of Judah. And so when these people come to him and say, look, we took care of the Ishbosheth problem for you, he doesn't say, you touch the Lord's anointed, because apparently he doesn't think that Ishbosheth is anointed by God to be king. But is David then therefore okay with what has happened to Ishbosheth? No, because what was it? It was outright murder of a righteous man. So here are two sons of Saul that apparently have fallen very far from two apples that have fallen very far from the tree. They're not chips off the old block. You've got Jonathan, you've got Ishbosheth, both of whom are described in the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel as righteous men, unlike their father. So pretty interesting that even Ishbosheth is a righteous man. Okay? He allows himself to be anointed king. I'm sure he thought, it's only natural. I deserve this. I'm the son of the former king. But even then, he's still described as a righteous man. And so David will have none of this. So why is this important, guys? Well, same thing we saw in chapter 3. The author wants you and I to realize that David is not going to be a king like the other nations. Saul was. A king like the other nations would have done what? He would have taken Abner out. He would have taken Ishbosheth out because they were potential threats to his throne. David doesn't operate like that. You come to me and you tell me that you killed my rival, and I'm telling you that the Lord is the one who is taking care of me. I don't need your help. I'm not trusting in human beings to put me on this throne. It was a promise that God gave me, and I will leave it in God's hands. I don't need to resort to these unrighteous means, these worldly means. In other words, he's starting off here much different than Saul. He is not a king like the other nations. Now, will he behave like we said last week? Are we going to see David behave at times like a king from another nation? Of course. He's not perfect. David is not the seed to come. David is not the Messiah. He's just the father of the Messiah. He's not the solution to the problem. He is part of the problem. So we're still waiting on that perfect king to come. But my goodness, David is vastly different from Saul. Well, we're almost finished. Let's read just a few verses from chapter 5. Tommy, would you turn please to Ezekiel 37? I want you to read a verse for us. And then, Brother Jim, would you turn to Luke chapter 3, verse 23? And when I call on you, would you mind reading that for us? Okay. So Tommy, yours will be Ezekiel 34:24, and Jim, yours will be Luke 3:23. So chapter 5, verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel, Ishbosheth is now dead, all the tribes of Israel come to David at Hebron, and they said, behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. This is it's a way of saying you led our forces in and out of battle, basically. So you were the ones who took care of us. It's funny, they sort of still have this idea in their head. We might read between the lines, and they say essentially, we liked Saul because we wanted Saul to take care of us, and we asked for a king who would defend us from our enemies, but you were actually the one who led us in victory. So it's almost like they're still thinking to themselves in the back of my mind, we want one of these kings like the other nations who's going to take care of us. And under Saul, you were always the one who did that. You were the best warrior. So, their motives are not necessarily pure. So previously, when Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. Now, as far as I can tell, this promise from God is not recorded in 1 Samuel. They're either summarizing what God has said or they're quoting something that is not recorded that God had told David that has made the rounds. And what is it? You will be a shepherd. What was David's vocation? What was he doing when he was anointed? Shepherding. When he defeated the great enemy of the people by the name of Goliath, where was he coming from? He was out in the fields with the flock. And so God has said, look, you're shepherding these sheep. I'm going to make you shepherd my people. Now, this is important because this serves as the template for the house of David. What is their job? Their job is to shepherd the people, which means, yes, to rule over them, but they are to shepherd them more specifically. So, Tommy, read Ezekiel 37, verse 24. All right, did you guys catch that? Ezekiel 37. Anybody remember how Ezekiel 37 starts off? The valley of the dry bones, remember? The bones come back to life. So this is a promise of something that God is going to do for His people in the future, that He's literally going to bring the dead back to life, all right? And so at the end, or toward the end of this chapter, chapter 37, verse 24, we are given this promise, this future promise, this eschatological promise, will be king over them. Over who? Over God's people when He saves them. When He does this great work of redemption in the future, on the other side of judgment, on the other side of exile, when the Messiah comes, He's going to be of the line of David. So we're not talking literally about David here. We're talking about David's son. And what's the promise specifically? He'll be king over them. They will all have what? One shepherd. So do you see 2 Samuel chapter 5, the people understand something. And they announce, you are our shepherd. And in announcing that, they basically set the pattern for the Davidic dynasty. All the way up to the great son of David, who fulfills this promise perfectly. The perfect shepherd of His people, who never fails, like, yes, David failed, and like, yes, all of his descendants failed. This is the perfect shepherd who will lead His people into life and into obeying the ordinances of God. So 2 Samuel 5 verse 2 is quite important, I would think. So God said, you're going to shepherd my people Israel. Verse 3 of 2 Samuel 5. So all of the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron, and they anointed David king over Israel. So he is no longer king simply over Judah. He is now the king of Israel. God has brought His word to pass. But, verse 4, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. So we're given this little detail. He becomes the king when he's 30. He reigns for 40 years, yes. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned for 33 years over all Israel and Judah. And we're about to see how he takes Jerusalem. Now, is this little detail about when David sort of comes into his throne and begins his life's work? Obviously, a lot had happened before that, but this is sort of the start of everything that God has promised him. Is it an incidental detail that he begins at age 30? Well, Brother Jim, read for us Luke 3, verse 23, if you would.
When he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Eli.
Coincidence, brothers and sisters? That David starts this great ministry as king, as shepherd over God's people Israel at the age of 30. Is it a coincidence that David's son, who fulfills all these Davidic promises, when does he begin his ministry? Now, did a lot happen to Jesus before he begins his? Of course. Just read about his birth, his miraculous birth. Read about how he is schooling the rabbis at age 12 in the temple. But when did it all really start popping off? When he's 30 years of age. So coincidence? Well, I would submit to you, no. That we have patterns that are established for us. And so the fact that he begins his ministry at, again, about the age of 30, might link him once again to his father, King David. Any questions or comments before we bring it to a close? Okay. Well, we'll end there then, and look forward to seeing you again the next time the Lord brings us together. And let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, what a joy it is that we have seen the fulfillment of these Davidic promises, that Lord, you put David on the throne for more than just to have a king who ruled over an ethnic people group. You put him on the throne because you were going to do something through him. Namely, you were going to bring about this promise made to Adam and Eve that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And so, Father, that greatest son of David has come. He is our shepherd. He is our ruler. He leads us to walk in your ordinances and in your commands. He is the one who has brought these dead people to life and has reconciled us to you. He is our good shepherd. He is our good king. He is our good ruler. He is everything that we need. He is our sufficiency, and He is that totally and completely. And so we rest, Lord, in Him. Thank you for your marvelous word, your marvelous promises, and your faithfulness that brings all this to pass. We pray it in our shepherd's name.